And now I
Okay.
have to find his bio.
Oh,
Uh, well, uh, Welcome, Dave. Dave McBride is a partner in the law firm of Young, Conaway, Stargate, and Taylor.
right.
He is the husband of Sally and the father of Sean, Dan, and Sarah. Sally is a native Delawarean, and Dave has lived here since 1965. Dave, Sally, and Sarah have been members of Westminster since the early 1990s. Dave has presented a number of adult education programs at Westminster on various topics, most recently the fall series that he and I did on the climate. He has been a member of Session, a member of the Earth Care Task Force now, and the Peace and Justice Task Force. So, without further ado, I'll keep admitting those that jump in now, Dave, and if you want to just go ahead, it's all yours.
Okay.
And if the rest of you would please mute, or I will mute you.
Well, let me say what we're the first thing I'm going to do is do a YouTube video by a woman by the name of Gabrielle Rifkin, who is a British mediator who specialized in international conflict resolution. She's the director of a operation called the Oxford Process, which works on conflict resolution, and she has worked on conflict resolution in both Ukraine and the Middle East. And I hope the two aren't an example of her lack of success in this area. Um, I guess I wanted to start by just saying that there were three reasons, or two reasons really, I wanted to do this program. Um, One is that I think we're in a particularly dangerous time. I don't know if any of you have. I've done programs in the past on a college professor I had by the name of Carol Quigley, who described the evolution of civilizations, and things in our country are playing out almost exactly as he predicted 50 years ago when I was a freshman at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, which is the other reason I wanted to do this. International affairs has been a love of mine since I became an anti-war protester in 1966. Um, and then we are also, there's another theory in international affairs that involves the circumstance where there's a major power that sort of dominates the world, like Britain did in the 1800s and the United States does now, and is confronted by a rising power that challenges it. It's called the Thucydides trap. Um, and in those circumstances in history, there's a recent book that came out a couple years ago examining those situations where that has existed, where there's a dominant power and a challenge by a rising power. And in 80% of the historical cases that that's occurred, the two powers end in war with each other. So it's we really need to figure out a way to help prevent war, and that's what this program is an attempt to do. And with that sort of introduction, I'm going to try to share my screen and play this video.
In the end, war is the greatest human rights abuse and does not make the world safer. We think we go to war for good moral reasons. We're fighting for good to triumph over evil.
This is not working.
Instead, we unleash a cascade of chaos and misery. In the 21st
Hey, we can
century,
hear her,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, I'm
States,
going to turn it
along
off
with
because
its
it's not
allies
working.
and my country, the United Kingdom, have been involved in 4 major wars:
you can just stop sharing.
Afghanistan,
I can't
Iraq,
seem
Libya,
to
Islamic State.
stop this thing.
And we have provided funding and supplied military equipment to Ukraine
Just
and
try stop
Israel.
sharing.
So
I did
let's
already.
consider the outcome of some of these wars. The Afghan war was a 20-year
Click back
war
on the application that you're running it
with the
from
Taliban
so
in
you can
power.
turn it off.
Yeah,
The
I'm
war
back there
in
and I'm
Iraq,
trying to
we
do
had
that
an
and it
immediate
won't stop.
military
It's
victory,
frozen.
which
My
was
screen is
short-lived.
frozen.
Can you quit the application that it's running from?
I just did.
Okay,
Now I got to get back to Zoom.
that killed it.
Yeah.
Well, we
Let-
see you.
All right. Well, let me try one more time if you guys don't mind. I got to shrink the screen again because it's a program worth listening to. My problem is pulling it up on my screen again. And I'm going to try again, and then I'll give up.
Well, then you can send me the link and you can talk while I try and find it myself.
Okay, let's see. Share. Can you see it?
Yes.
And I got to turn the
In
sound
the
on.
end, war is the greatest human rights abuse and does not make the world safer. We think we go to war for good moral reasons. We're fighting for good to triumph over evil. Instead, we unleash a cascade of chaos and misery. In the 21st century, the United States, along with its allies and my country, the United Kingdom, have been involved in 4 major wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Islamic State. And we have provided funding and supplied military equipment to Ukraine and Israel. So let's consider the outcome of some of these wars. The Afghan war was a 20-year war, and we left the Taliban in power. The war in Iraq, we had an immediate military victory, which was short-lived civil war and contributed to the war in Syria. The war in Libya unleashed chaos and violence in the Sahel region. The war against Islamic State weakened it militarily, but none of the root causes were dealt with. All of you in the audience know war is horrendous, but maybe many of you believe that it is inevitable. I would like to persuade you today that there are many things that we can do. Even if we commit to arming countries militarily like porcupines, we can commit ourselves to war prevention, early mediation, and getting into the mind of the enemy. I direct the Oxford process. It's a conflict resolution organization. And what we try and do is create back channels to the political leadership at the highest levels of those who are in positions of power and can decide the future of the outcome of the war. I come from a group psychoanalytic background, but I'm passionately committed to putting together the human mind and geopolitics, its power relationships, and what does and doesn't lead to war. We know marginalization, humiliation, and exclusion are some of the key drivers of war. We also know that war dehumanizes people. Some of the conflicts I've worked on are the Palestine-Israel, the Iranian nuclear issue, and now the Russia-Ukraine war.
Are you all seeing this?
So
Yes, Dave.
what do we
Okay.
do
We
to
hear it.
prevent war? We need to address the security concerns of all sides not just our own security. Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 and then all of Ukraine in 2022. It was morally justified for us to support a country whose sovereignty had been breached. But now, hundreds of thousands of people are dead and wounded, and we do have to ask, what else could we have done? President Putin warned that if NATO edged up on the Russian border, war would be the result. In 2008, President Bush stated Ukraine would join NATO. Germany and France pushed back, as they knew it would create a new crisis between Russia and the West. Would the US have tolerated a hostile military presence on its border in Mexico and Canada? We might have avoided this war if we'd addressed the security concerns both of Russia and Europe, and established a common European security architecture before the war, and it will need to happen afterwards. Western governments could have played more of a mediating role, supporting Ukraine to be a bridge between East and West, not just encouraging Ukraine into our zone of interest. Ukraine has difficult geography. It will always need to find a way to coexist with its Russian neighbor. What else could we do? We need to come off our moral pedestal and stop deciding what is good and evil. We need to talk to the bad guys, the men of violence, if we are to end war. We understood we had to talk to the IRA in Northern Ireland, FARC in Colombia, and ETA in the Basque Country. But usually we want to speak to the good guys, the people like us, the people in grey suits. Back in 2001, after the Afghan war, and as part of the Bonn peace process, if we had brought the Taliban in when they were weaker, things may have looked different. Western governments, including the US and the UK, refused to talk to President Assad. They said it was talking to evil. By not talking to him, we created a greater evil, as thousands and thousands more people died. Today, many of you will have the Ukraine-Russia war and Hamas-Israel on your minds and what can be done. This is the work Oxford Process does quietly behind the scenes to explore whether there are opportunities to end war. But it requires the blessings of Western government, and they often don't have an exit plan. To end the war in Ukraine, we will need to talk to President Putin. We will need to understand his red lines, what his end game is, what opportunities there are for a ceasefire. After the heinous massacre of 7/11, engaging with Hamas is unthinkable. To many Israelis, following the terrible carnage in Gaza, Hamas has even more support and will need to be included in some kind of future process. Now both sides have dehumanized each other. One way through is the release of Marwan Barghouti, a Palestinian leader who has spent the last 2 decades in an Israeli prison. He supports a future Palestinian state sitting side by side with Israel. And he has the leadership qualities to unite the Palestinian people, which will be essential. For some, he's the new Mandela. For others, he has blood on his hands. In war, everybody has blood on their hands. The Americans are now talking about two-state solution. which would involve normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And yet again, we cannot just speak to our friends and exclude our enemies. And Iran and its allies will only sabotage the process. Each one of you here today wants to make a difference. But we can feel small and impotent in the face of war. But how we behave individually is a microcosm of how we behave in war. None of us like to engage with people who think differently to us. We all divide the world into good and evil, people we want to talk to and people we don't. But we need to engage with everybody and understand the radical differences that exist between us. And we need to start today. What else can we do? We need to act early and put in place early mediating processes. In war, there's an opportunity for mediation in some wars when the parties are on the precipice and they're more open to compromise. Then there's a second opportunity when they've tested their battlefield strength and realized they have not achieved their original objectives. When these opportunities are missed, the parties become hardened by the horrors and trauma of war. They believe they have sacrificed too much to compromise and make peace. So what can we do to make these ideas real? Today, the UN is a weakened institution, and many have lost faith in it. But if we're to be serious about peacemaking, we will need to strengthen it again. One way through is to empower the UN to have statutory early mediation when countries are on the edge of tipping to war, and then 3 months later when they've tested their battlefield strength. The UN would also appoint permanent war prevention teams embedded in the countries at risk of going to war, high-level mediators, and permanent peace tables. We would establish them in such areas as Sudan, Pakistan, India, Taiwan, China, Palestine, Israel, the US, China. We would be committed to prevention and early intervention. So in conclusion, liberal democracies should see themselves first and foremost as mediators and bridge builders and help countries manage their radical differences. Not the world's self-appointed policeman or supplier of weapons. Instead of providing drones and missiles, we could contribute more resources and expertise to mediation and peacemaking. We would put all our passions and pragmatism into avoiding war. War is like a cancer. It spreads quickly. Once it's progressed far enough, nobody knows how to stop it. Treat it quickly, even prevent it. Millions of lives can be saved. We behave as if war is inevitable. It is not. Thank you, my friends.
If you could just turn the sound up a little bit for me, thank you.
Okay.
I don't have to see any picture.
Okay, well, I like that. I said first of all, let me say I don't know whether her prescriptions for what might have avoided the war in Ukraine is correct or not. There's a huge debate about that, and I don't know whether her whether bringing Hamas into a peace process in the Middle East is a solution or the problem. But what I liked about her is that she mixes two schools of international thought, international affairs thought. One is the realist school when she talks about what causes war and says we need to get off our moral pedestal when evaluating war and conflict. And the other is an idealist school when she talks about trying to create the institutions and the UN in particular that might prevent war. So with that, let me turn to I guess I don't know how many of these questions I'll get through. If I get through two, I'll be lucky. And let me ask anyone to interrupt me. You probably have to speak up because I may not see your hand, but either raise your hand or just speak up with any questions. As Gabrielle Rifkin said, war is the most inhumane thing that man has ever devised. It actually threatens now to destroy our species, and it inflicts countless harm on millions. The moral imperative, in my view, with comes to war and peace, is peace itself. It seems to me that anyone advocating the use of military force must demonstrate a compelling need that cannot be met by peaceful means. And I think it's important that the effects of war, as are being shown by, started with the Vietnam War, when that war was brought into our living rooms, so to speak, through television, and now with the Ukrainian war and the war in Gaza being done again. It's important that we see the real human costs of war so that the rather abstract geopolitical theories that often support war are not do not outweigh the true costs of war itself. Now, given that war is the most heinous thing that man does to man, it's probably understandable that people would think that that terrible thing must be caused by evil men or women doing evil things for evil purposes. But I think the history of war demonstrates that that's not usually true, that war is usually caused by good people, but profoundly flawed people, pursuing what they believe are necessary military actions for good ends. World War I is an example of that, a war no one wanted to fight, yet it went on for 4 years through miscalculation and just human nature. As Gabrielle Rifkin said, we think we go to war for good moral reasons. We're fighting for good to triumph over evil. Instead, we unleash a cascade of chaos and misery. I think it's a common feature of war, and I'll come back to it, that each side trumpets the justice of its side and vilifies the other side. And there's reasons that happens. There's political reasons that happens. But let me first say, if evil men acting for evil purposes usually do not cause war, then what does? Well, the answer, there's probably as many answers to that question as there are wars, but there's one answer that I would say is probably the prevailing answer in the modern era, up to now at least, and that's that war is caused by nations seeking security, and sometimes by nations seeking what they believe to be justice. Now, there are other causes. There's things that are innate to human nature and human culture that have a tendency towards violence. But with modern nation states, it seems that the primary problem is the search for security. And the search for security is occurring in anarchic conditions, a state of anarchy. And what we mean by that is there's no overarching authority. There's no world government or world court, at least with the means of adjudicating or resolving conflict or ensuring security. We've tried to establish structures like that after World War I with the League of Nations and then again after World War II. But they have not been very effective. One of the reasons for that is that most nations, if they think their vital interests are at stake, will not cede authority to another entity. So the search for security and the search for justice occurs in a state of anarchy. Now that causes a number of problems. One of the major problems is what's called the security paradox. Every step that one nation takes, which it views as a defensive step to secure itself, is viewed by other nations as an offensive step. And they take steps which they view as being in defense to the first move, which the first mover views as a threat to it. And that security paradox creates a host of problems. What else? Well, there's international and domestic instability. In our present time, we have domestic instability in the United States itself. We have domestic instability in the EU. And to a certain extent, we had domestic instability in Russia, and before that, the Soviet Union beginning in the late 80s and through the 90s. That stability was, if you will, stabilized by Putin by ruthless means, but the international and domestic instability can contribute to the cause of war. Then there's another major problem in international relations that causes war, and that's misperception. I used to have a professor at the School of Foreign Service that said, every war is caused by a miscalculation, because if the parties could accurately look into the future and realize what was going to happen, they wouldn't fight the war. Well, there's reasons why that's not always true, because there are situations where nations have fought wars where they knew or thought they were probably going to lose. In fact, it surprises me, but that was the case in World War II with Japan. The Japanese didn't think they would win that war. But misperception is a big problem. The misperceptions relate to all sorts of things. I mean, one thing that contributes as a misperception that contributes to war is you misperceive the threat to yourself. Our war in Iraq was a perfect example of that. We went into that war, at least we were told by our government, because Iraq or Saddam Hussein potentially had weapons of mass destruction, which turned out not to be true. The perceived threat was either a fiction created by the government or a tremendous intelligence failure. The other great misperception that occurs is the costs of war. It's very common for parties to enter into a war believing the war will be short and will be over quickly. All the parties to World War I believed that would happen. None of them believed that war would go on for 4 years and millions of deaths. Our own Civil War was the same sort of situation where both sides believed the war would be over pretty quickly. Of course, it wasn't. So the problem of misperception contributes to war. Then there's the escalation cycle, the common circumstance where once the war starts, one side, believing that they are disadvantaged in some way or losing, escalates the conflict, the other responds with escalation, and the cycle goes on and on. And once that cycle starts, it's extremely difficult to end it. Another problem, another contributor to war, is the belief that war is inevitable. oftentimes countries enter into wars because they think the war is inevitable, and they think that if it is inevitable, it's better to fight it now than later. Germany in World War I believed the war with Russia was inevitable. They also realized that Russia was getting more powerful with each passing year. And the German high command went to the Kaiser and told him, who was a cousin of the Tsar in Russia, and also to the king in England, and said, we're going to have to fight a war with Russia. Better that we do it now than later. I think Israel believes that there's an inevitability of a war with Iran, or believed it was better to fight that war now than later. So a belief in the inevitability of war can cause countries to go to war, even when it doesn't make sense. And then, of course, once the war begins, as Gabriel Rifkin said, and once you miss the opportunity to try to end the war at an early stage or before it starts, then both sides get hardened in their positions from the sacrifices that they have made. And that drives people towards total war. It drives people to a situation where there's no compromise solution that's palatable. And that if there's no compromise solution that's palatable, it means that a total victory is the only way to end the war. I think that that may be the situation in the Middle East now. In Ukraine, it's come out in the last 9 or 10 months that during the first several months of the war, there was an opportunity. There's a tremendous debate as to how genuine it was, but Russia seemed to want to end the war. It hadn't gone as they had expected. They were in negotiations with the Ukrainians, and there were actual resolutions that were written up, peace plans, agreements that were at least the beginning of an end to the war. And unfortunately, at least the reporting that I've read, the United States actually discouraged the Ukrainians from entering into those to entering into or even pursuing those negotiations, because the United States believed that Putin wouldn't honor any commitment that he made to stop the fighting, because in the period from 2014 until 2022, in the area that Russia had invaded before, the area of Ukraine they invaded before, they'd been fighting a war for 8 years in the Donbass, and there were agreements and truces reached that were broken. Both sides blamed the other. Of course, it's the United States position that it was Russia that broke the truces, and that's the same problem we have now that was evidenced in the now infamous Oval Office session with Zelensky and President Trump, where Zelensky was trying to make the point that that they were willing to negotiate, but that you couldn't trust Putin to live up to any truce or peace. And then there's the problem of justice, and I will come back to that. But let me turn now to what Gabrielle Rifkin said about preventing war. She said, what we need to do is, quote, war prevention, mediation, and this last one's what really interests me, getting into the mind of the enemy. In order for there to be peace, we need to understand both sides. We need, as she also said, we need to understand them perhaps as well as they understand themselves. But we've got to get into their heads to understand what their needs are, what their perceptions are, or else we can't find a compromise if we don't master those things. And one of the first things, and I've learned this from my own educating myself about particular wars. I did this in the case of the Vietnam War when I was 16 years old and started off as a hawk and I was going to write a term paper in my junior year in high school about why we needed to fight that war and win it. The first thing I did was I started reading the history of Vietnam. And I realized as I read that history, we were in Vietnam, if you all remember, because of the so-called domino theory, that if we allowed the Viet Cong to conquer South Vietnam, then China would move over all of Southeast Asia. And I learned from the history that the Vietnamese and the Chinese were natural enemies, as is often the case for a smaller country bordering a larger one. And it became evident to me that the only reason the Chinese and the Vietnamese were allied while the war was going on was because of the war, and that if the war ended, that natural adversarial relationship would probably reemerge. Sure enough, after the war ended, it did. The Vietnamese and Chinese fought a border war several years after the Vietnam War ended. But and in the Ukraine, I started off with the belief that this was just outright, brutal aggression by Russia. And then when I read the history of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the period that what followed after that, I realized it's a much more complicated story than just Putin's probably desire to restore as much of the former Soviet Union as he can restore, which is a desire not unique to Putin. Russia has had a security interest in having a border that runs along the mountains near the Polish border for going back thousands of years, because once the border moves away from those mountains, there's just a plain that makes it easy for an invading army to invade Russia, which Napoleon did and which Hitler did. So you need to learn the history of any conflict to even begin to understand where the parties are at the moment and what their needs are and what their perceptions are. I mean, I think that it's absolutely critical in the situation in the Middle East to understand, why did Israel give up on the peace process after Oslo, and even after several attempts after Oslo to reach a peace agreement? And what is it that is driving Hamas and Iran in their efforts to annihilate Israel? Because it's really part of a bigger view than just Israel. It's a part of what they view as a Western encroachment on Muslim lands. Then Gabriel Rifkin said, the other thing we need to do is we need to address the security concerns of each side, not just our own security. Well, that goes back, she made that point in the context of the Ukrainian situation. There were efforts made in the 1990s to create what was called a European security structure that would incorporate Russia into the security structure. And then unfortunately, and I can't go into the details about that, but unfortunately, the Clinton administration abandoned those efforts, or much of those efforts, in the late 1990s because Bill Clinton became concerned that he was going to be accused of being a peacenik or a pacifist, or would lose politically by being too accommodating to the Russians. So efforts were made and then dropped, and then the relationship became much more sort of adversarial. Then Gabriel Rifkin said, we need to come off our moral pedestal and stop deciding what is good and evil. I think the important thing here is that we need to understand the justice concerns of both sides. I mean, to me, the Middle East situation is a perfect example of two parties in conflict where each has a substantial justice concern or position. And unfortunately, I think that in order for that conflict to end, in any way other than a total victory for one side or the other, both sides are going to need to compromise on what they view as their justice concerns. And those justice concerns are legitimate. Nonetheless, it's going to require a compromise to end the fighting, or a total victory by one side or the other. And then she said, another thing is we need to understand the differences in civilizations. Because different civilizations have different value systems. Not huge, striking, like all civilizations have certain of the same humanitarian concerns. But there are subtle but important differences in value structures between civilizations. For example, in Asian civilizations, there's much more of an emphasis on the importance of relationships and the community, much less emphasis than in the West on the importance of individual liberties. And so those different value systems can affect both the justice concerns and the threat perceptions. Then let me talk about, well, let me just say the next topic I wanted to talk about was the use and misuse of military power and how it contributes to war. I think there is, in most wars, there is one of the contributing factors is typically an overestimation of what military power can accomplish. And the overestimation comes in two ways. Sometimes there's an overestimation in the actual ability to accomplish military objectives themselves. For example, Russia's invasion of Ukraine had a gross overestimation of their military capability of taking Kiev, deposing the government, and putting a puppet regime in place, which is what Putin thought he was going to accomplish. But there's another way in which there's a military overestimation, and that is military power has difficulty accomplishing limited objectives unless there's a political objective that's defined that can be accomplished. So, for example, when we went into Afghanistan, it made a difference what we defined as our objective. If our objective was simply to root out the terrorist organizations that the Taliban had permitted to exist in Afghanistan, of course, the Taliban was not the organization responsible for the 9/11 attack, but they had permitted Osama bin Laden to have camps in Afghanistan from which the attack was planned or arguably launched. If that had been our limited objective, we could have potentially accomplished it. But the objective became much bigger than that. The objective became to make Afghanistan a democracy and help transform that area of the world. And that was an objective that required a much bigger war effort and a much more difficult war effort. So there's a tendency for the use of military power to start expanding the objectives unless political objectives are clearly defined. And that gets me to the last point about military power. Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general who in the 1800s wrote a treatise on war, had a saying something to the effect of, war is the continuation of policy and politics by other means. And when I first heard that quote, I wondered, what does that mean? And so I read his treatise. And what he meant was all wars end with a political solution. I mean, even if the political solution is total surrender, all wars must end with a political solution. So when you go to war, you need to define what is the political solution you're trying to accomplish. Now, I think in the case of Israel and Hamas, you may recall, the Biden administration kept pushing Israel for what is your day after going to look like? And the reason I think that question was so critical is that if your day after was going to be a Palestinian state or a Gaza ruled by moderate Palestinians who don't want to make war on Israel, then you can't have that and destroy the entirety of Gaza. That military operation is inconsistent with that political objective. So what is your political objective? And that's what I think is in so many of the wars we have fought, we have misdefined the objective of the war. And because we misdefine the objective of the war, we either start a war that we shouldn't start because the objective is not a feasible one, a la Iraq and remaking Iraq into a democracy, or even Afghanistan if the objective was remaking Afghanistan, or in the case of the Israel-Hamas fight. Now, Hamas's objective when they launched the October 7 attack was to trigger a regional war because Hamas knew that it could not win a war against Israel sort of one-on-one. It hoped, and we now have documentation, it hoped to trigger a regional war in which Iran, Hezbollah, and the Houthis would all become involved because the only possibility of defeating Israel and destroying Israel was by a regional war. Now that was an objective, that was, I think, an example of misperception because Hezbollah and Iran didn't come to Hamas's aid as Hamas had expected or hoped that they would. Now, maybe that they started the war realizing they were going to lose it for other reasons. But those are the kinds of, again, to go back to Clausewitz, war is politics by other means. You need to define, for any war to end, there's got to be a political solution. So it's critical to define what is the political solution you're trying to accomplish and what military means. First of all, is a military means the best method of getting to that solution? And what is the best military operation to meet that? And with that, I'll shut up. Questions? To ask for questions.
If you have a question, raise your hand or go in the reactions and raise your hand and I'll try and catch you and then unmute. Well,
And please feel free to disagree with me. I appreciate disagreement.
Well, Dave, I will only say that I remember as World War I began, there were joyous celebrations in the streets of, I don't know which, of Germany and Britain, I think, because they thought that they were going to do the right thing and win a war quickly. I mean, it's mind-boggling now that you think about it.
It is. And there was something else about World War I that I didn't appreciate until I read, I've now read several histories of World War I, but there's one thing I didn't appreciate. The history that I'd always heard started with the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Yeah. Serbian.
Well, what I didn't realize was that there were a series. We've got a question from Lynn.
Right.
Go ahead, Lynn.
Oh, you can continue. You don't have to cut off.
There were a series of crises before that. And it's very interesting. What happened in each of those crises, the crisis reached its pinnacle and then it got resolved. But the parties each side came out of the resolution of the crisis believing that they'd been taken advantage of. And they came out of the crisis saying, we're never going to let that happen again. And each crisis got higher and higher. So when the last crisis occurred that began with the assassination of the Archduke, that resulted, by the way, from his car going down the wrong street. Otherwise, that might not have ever happened. So there's chance in history is the big factor. But when the crisis occurred, two phenomenon were at play. On the one hand, everybody was saying, I'll be damned, we're not giving in to those SOBs like we did last time. We're not going to let them take advantage of us. But on the other hand, everybody said, well, war would be crazy. Somehow or another, we're going to avoid the war. This will be solved. We won't go to war. We always solved it in the past. And so it's of concern to me that we seem to be in a series of escalating crises. Certainly that's occurred both in the Middle East and in the Eastern Europe.
Lynn, why don't you go ahead then?
Yeah, so many of the recent wars, skirmishes, the conflict around the world have been what we refer to as proxy wars, or you have smaller entities fighting, but actually being supported by much more major players and things. And so I'm not sure I even have a specific question, but can you talk more on the impacts of having these bigger supporters and different alliances and things that support different groups and the impacts that has in either helping prevent or encourage and inflate wars?
I don't know. I haven't, I'm gonna say I haven't studied or read on that either in preparation for this or generally, but it's certainly my impression that most wars are made worse by larger powers intervening because if for nothing else, they provide arms and support, and they make the war a deeper and typically longer conflict. I suppose there are circumstances where a power can intervene to prevent war. I think actually the United States, when it when the after the October 7 attacks, both Israel and Hamas, I think, to a certain extent, believed or hoped. Israel believed, Hamas hoped that Iran and Hezbollah would come to Hamas's aid, and that that attack and Israel's counterattack on Hamas would expand into a regional war. And the United States, one of the reasons the United States came out so forcefully in support of Israel at that time, and I just finished reading this chapter in the book War, Carl Woodward's book War, on that period, was to send a signal to Iran and to Hezbollah, don't get involved in this fight. So I suppose there are circumstances when a great power could intervene and have a deterrent effect, or could intervene and have a restraining effect, like the United States did Israel. I just finished reading this chapter. Israel, Netanyahu and his the Secretary of Defense wanted to attack Hezbollah right after October 7th. And Biden, and they came to Biden and said, we want your support. We want you to help us. And Biden said, no, I'm not going to help you. And we're opposed to doing this. We think it's a major mistake. And so they restrained Israel from attacking Hezbollah at that time. So I suppose great powers, the intervention of a major power could on occasion have a deterrence effect and on occasion have a restraining effect on the parties, but it seems like mostly it makes things worse.
Mark, you want to
And
go ahead?
Mark,
Thank you. Yeah, my question was kind of what you were answering already. I just wanted to know your thoughts on US's heavily involvement in both of the current wars you mentioned, Ukraine and Israel-Palestine, in supplying weapons and so forth. You've kind of answered part of it, but if you could elaborate on both those.
I think we had a I think we have difficult policy decisions with respect to, I'll take Israel first. Um, I think I think the concern, I don't know if this was right or not, and I got to say, when it, I think the definition of humility is realizing how flawed your own perception of reality is and how flawed your ability to predict what the future will be. And almost all policy decisions are based on your perception of what is reality and your prediction as to how things will play out if certain things happen or don't happen. And if we know anything about humans, it's that our cognitive capacity in both those is extremely flawed. So I say this with the humility derived from those flaws. I think the concern was that if the United States showed a separation or distance from Israel early on, that it would have a risk the war being expanded, because I think the United States perceived that it was playing a deterrent role in that situation. I think the other problem, and this really gets complicated, but I believed on October 7 that there were two obstacles to a peace in the Middle East: Hamas and the Netanyahu government, or at least the right-wing extremist in the Netanyahu government. And I don't know if you followed this, but the first thing Biden said right after the attack on October 7 was he made two statements that were anathema to Netanyahu. I mean, if Netanyahu was paying attention, he knew that he and Biden were on a collision course, and it was only a question of when, not if. One was Biden said there's no solution to this except the two-state solution. Well, Netanyahu rejects
It's
a
8
two-state
o'clock.
solution. So when Biden said that after October 7, Netanyahu knew that Biden and I don't share a mutual objective in the Middle East. And then and I'm thinking there was another one that Biden, the other one, Biden said that the status quo is in Gaza is not sustainable. And by that, I think he meant that the suppression of the Palestinian people in Gaza, as the Netanyahu government had been doing for decades, was not a sustainable policy. You can't prevent war or maintain peace by that method. Ironically, the right-wing portion of Netanyahu's coalition agrees with that. Netanyahu didn't agree with it because it was his policy, what they called mowing the lawn, where they would go in and periodically attack or respond to attacks by Hamas, and to keep the lid on the situation. And they tried to buy Hamas off by allowing aid from Qatar to be distributed to Hamas. The great flaw in Netanyahu's pre-October 7 policy. So we were preventing Hamas from being an obstacle to peace was largely a military, but also a political problem. Preventing Netanyahu's government from being an obstacle to peace was largely a political problem. And I think Biden knew that. You remember, Netanyahu was very unpopular right after the October 7 attack. I think Biden hoped that his political future would outlive Netanyahu's. And of course, it turned out to be just the opposite. And the other thing about arms, I think at the point in time where it became possible for a Trump administration to succeed the Biden administration, it would have done no good for us to have threatened Israel with cutting off arms, because Israel would have simply waited for the new administration to come in. In fact, they would use that as a political tool in the United States to help bring about a change in administration. So there's just so many moving parts to these issues that hard to know what's, I think it's not only hard to know, but it's probably impossible to know what's right. And you never know whether what you didn't do would have been the right thing because you can't write, it's hard to write a counterfactual history of what would have happened had you done something different. And maybe if we had behind the scenes threatened to cut off military supplies and force Israel to define its political objectives in Gaza and forced it to maybe fight a war more in tune with having a survivable Gaza after when the war ended, maybe that would have made a difference. I I kind of doubt it, but maybe.
Yeah, one of the other things that Biden did say was um, cautioned Netanyahu not to make the same mistake we'd
He
made in
did.
Iraq.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, sounds like he's making the same mistake.
Yeah. I really think I think that's why to me, when I talked about history, I think to understand Netanyahu, there was a great PBS, there's two great PBS documentaries that one was about the Oslo peace process and showed how the extremists in both Israel who assassinated Rabin while the Oslo process was going on, and Hamas who conducted terrorist operations to try to derail the process from the Palestinian side, how the extremists from both sides not only upset the peace process itself, but extremists on each side would use the extremist on the other side as justification for their extreme policies. And I'm afraid that Israel made made a judgment, and I can't say that it would be a judgment that wouldn't be supported by evidence that there will be no peace, um, and that some form of annexation of at least the West Bank, maybe Gaza, is the only solution. Now, I think the more hopeful solution is that the Arab nations will step up and take over Gaza, fund the rebuilding, and police the area. Um, the optimistic interpretation of President Trump's declaration that the United States should own Gaza and will build a great resort there is that was an effort to try to encourage Saudi Arabia and Qatar to do what they did subsequently do a couple of weeks later, which is come forward with a more concrete proposal as to how they would rebuild Gaza. Um, so maybe that's the possibility. But I mean, as Gabriel Rifkin said, I don't know, but Barghouti, do you know his name? Am I saying it right, Mark? Do you know? The Gabriel Rifkin mentioned someone in an Israeli prison who I've heard referred to before as the Palestinian Mandela, that he's a leader that has the credibility to unite the Palestinians, and he believes in a two-state solution. He doesn't believe in the destruction of Israel. Of course, the PLO also, or the PLA, also accepted the idea of a two-state solution and accepted Israel's right to exist, which Hamas and Iran and Hezbollah do not. Um, uh, but the PLA or the PLO, I guess it's the PLA now, Palestinian Liberation Administration, is pretty thoroughly discredited among the Palestinian people because of its own corruption in ineffectiveness. So
Dave, we're past the
yeah,
hour. Maybe one more question or a comment. You said a hopeful possibility in Gaza. Is there any hopeful possibility for Ukraine and Russia?
I you know I'm I'm hopeful that I think there's a very real possibility that there's a truce. In fact, I guess it was 2 years ago, there were two articles in Foreign Affairs Quarterly. I don't know if you all know what Foreign Affairs Quarterly is. It's published by a group called the Council of Foreign Relations, which is the foreign policy establishment of America, for better or for worse. So that might be an impeaching characteristic. But there were two articles 2 years ago talking about the possibility of a truce in Ukraine and saying that in Korea, the Korean War never ended. It still hasn't ended. We are still technically at war in Korea.
Right.
The situation that exists in Korea is a truce that was established during the war, and that truce has held for what now, 50 years, 60 years? And we have two sovereign nations there with the truce line as their border. And these articles in Foreign Affairs Quarterly were talking about the seeming inevitability that this war in the Ukraine was going to end with a truce line, something like where the line is now, that it would move a little one way or a little another way. And the authors of these articles said, well, they hoped that what happened in Korea doesn't happen in the Ukraine. What happened in Korea was there was talk about a truce, and it took 2 years for the talk about a truce to ultimately result in the cessation of hostilities. And during that time, 50,000 people died in the war. And so these articles were saying, boy, I hope people can come to their senses, and it won't take 2 years for people to come to their senses. But it now has been 2 years. So I'm optimistic that there will be a truce. The real question is, will there be a sustainable peace? And the options in that regard, what Ukraine wants for us, well, Trump made a big concession for the Ukraine. They're probably something they didn't want to give up at the beginning of negotiations, and that was, you're not getting your land back. Because Ukraine's technical position up until very recently was, we want the crime. Not only do we want the land that was taken in the 2022 in this war, but we want the land that was taken in 2014, which would be Crimea and the Donbass.
Dave, I'm gonna have to cut you off.
So
So
yeah,
people can get about their lives, but
sorry.
no, it's been very, very interesting. We could go on for quite a
Yeah,
while.
we could.
Yeah. So,
Well, thanks everybody for putting up with me.
Thank
well,
you.
thank you,
Thank
Dave.
you very much, Dave. Always
give-
interesting.
Give him a round of applause,
Thanks.
and we'll let him go. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hope you join us next week.
Thank you.
And I have forgotten already, but it was a very interesting topic next week too, I know.
And it's not me yammering away, so that's it.
Very good. Thank you all.
Bye, everybody.
Right.
Thanks.
Bye.